Alright YouTube, hey, this video is going to be a little shout out to Mr. Biotrex 310. It looks like my How to Play Warhammer Fantasy series has helped him out, and it made me realize I need to do a truly quick overview of the differences between Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k. My How to Play Warhammer series evolved into 11 videos. That was what it was supposed to originally do. But anyways, hold on guys and let's go. In 40k, you have the movement phase, the shooting phase, and the assault phase. We're all familiar with that. In fantasy, it is very similar with the addition of one other phase. It's called the magic phase. In fantasy, they go as follows: movement, magic, shooting, and then close combat or assault. Alright guys, we're going to move on to the movement phase. In 40k and fantasy, they're both similar, but then they're also different. Everything has a movement stat. 40k, everything moves typically 6 inches, 12 inches, a multiple of 6. Fantasy is not the case. You have varying multiples, varying movement, as low as 3 inches for lowly dwarves, all the way up to 10 inches for speedy Slaneshi demons. You can charge in fantasy, which would double that movement, and that's how you get into close combat, where in 40k you have a separate phase called an assault phase where you get a second movement. When you get into woods or difficult terrain in both systems, in fantasy it slows you down by half. So that 4-inch human was now moving at 2 inches. Where in 40k you get to roll 2 dice and take the highest. Not a bad deal. So unless you have move through cover, then you can roll 3 dice and take the highest. As you can see from that, terrain in 40k is more part of the battlefield. You want to use terrain. You want to get in terrain. In fantasy, unless you're a skirmisher, you want to stay out of terrain because it slows you down. Terrain like woods blocks line of sight. It no longer blocks line of sight. In 40k it confers a cover save. So that's another little difference. Alright, the one thing fantasy has that 40k doesn't is the magic phase. The magic phase is one of the it's a pretty potent phase. I would say it can be more potent than shooting. I won't go into the details. If you want to see all the details on fantasy, on how to play or do the magic, go look at my how to play videos, and it'll be in there. Next we're going to move on to is the shooting phase. Okay, in 40k we're all pretty much familiar with how that works. You know, you pick a target, you roll your ballistic skill, you hit. They get a cover save. Fantasy, there's no such thing as cover saves. If you see the unit, you shoot it, you hit it. Otherwise, if you don't see it, you can't shoot it. One of the big differences that a lot of 40k players aren't used to is when you go over to fantasy is there's modifiers to hit. Such as, it's called soft cover, hard cover, and each one of those is like a +1 or a +2 to your roll. If you move, that's another plus, and there's no cover saves. Oh, and in long range it's +1. So shooting, you know, even though you might have a ballistic skill of 4, needing 3s to hit, then it doesn't matter. I mean, depends on range and stuff, so it's a little more in-depth. Overall, the rule books are, I guess, I don't know, they're about the same thickness, but there's a lot more rules in fantasy than in 40k, but don't let that scare you, because if you've played 40k for a while, then the transition is not that hard. Fantasy just picked back up in our area, and all of our players are 40k players, and I've been training them on how to play, and it's working out pretty good so far. Alright, and then we got the assault phase in 40k, or the close combat phase. A little bit of difference: when you want to assault someone, you get that extra movement to assault them, and then an extra attack. You don't get that in fantasy. In fantasy, during your movement phase, if you charged and contacted the enemy, then they're in close combat when the close combat phase. So there's not another movement phase like in 40k. So it's just a little bit different. The way close combat works, you guys, I should have mentioned this in the shooting, but the to hit and to wound charts for both games are identical. Ballistic skills, weapon skills, you know, there's no change. You guys are familiar with those, so it's a pretty easy transition. Alright, one thing that's different in fantasy than 40k is there's a lot more modifiers as far as close combat. Like I mentioned earlier, you don't get the +1 attack for charging. What you do get, the guy that charges, he gets to go first. So that's a huge difference. Fantasy, the combat, close combat or assault, tends to be more brutal, or it's over quickly. unless you're playing like an undead army. But it seems to be more decisive than in 40K. A lot of times the combat only lasts 1 turn, maybe 2. In 40K, you can get stuck in a combat with a big mob of orcs like forever. The modifiers, there's more modifiers. 40K, the 5th edition, they sort of stole some of the modifiers from Fantasy. Like if you lose by 3, you take a leadership at -3. Well, Fantasy already had that. But Fantasy also has a few more modifiers, like if you hit someone in the flank or the rear and you outnumber. Well, I already mentioned outnumber. But so that makes Fantasy, it's a little more deadly than in 40K. Okay, some of the other things, that's the quick overview of the different phases. One of the things, Fantasy, it's my favorite game, don't get me wrong. But 40K, Games Workshop is pumping out, upcoming here in a month or 2, I think July, is Planet Strike, which is going to be a supplement. Then they're going to do a Mighty Empires equivalent. If you guys don't know what Mighty Empires is, that's a hex tile system. They're coming up with it for the 40K. Hopefully the rules will be a little bit better. Major differences. 40K, you've got kill points, outflank, more variety of missions. Fantasy, the variety is not there. I mean, you can add more variety, but it's pretty much a pitched battle every time. So, but there is a strategy. In 40K, you try to set up the terrain in a equal manner, and then you roll off. In Fantasy, terrain placement is actually part of your strategy. So that's another difference. And also, like in both systems, one thing I like about Warhammer over 40K is how many times has your character died from a sergeant with a power fist or a knob with a power claw and stuff, and you can't target him back. That's sort of stinks. I think characters are slightly weaker. I'm not going to say they're wimps and don't take them, but they're not as strong as they typically are in Warhammer Fantasy. In Warhammer Fantasy, characters tend to be a little more durable. Now, granted, a human character versus a Chaos Lord, there's no comparison. The Chaos Lord should mop the floor with him, but he doesn't cost as many points. It's the same in 40K also. Alright guys, one area to let you know that's different is in 40K, a lot of armies, they stick around for the whole combats. They don't fail too many leadership tests. In Fantasy, leadership is huge. Whether you're taking a terror test, panic test, break test, it's huge. And one of the differences is your force commander or independent character usually doesn't bestow his leadership. I know it does for Space Marines, but overall doesn't bestow his leadership to the rest of the units. Oh yeah, I forgot, Imperial Guard has something too. In Fantasy, if you're within 12 inches of your general, you can use his leadership for break tests or fear tests and that kind of thing. So that's another little difference I wanted to touch on. Alright, one of the big differences, and I think one thing that attracts people to 40K, is who doesn't like a gun and tanks and big monstrous creatures and stuff, although Fantasy can have the monstrous creatures, is I think it's overall cheaper to get into the 40K. You don't have as many models. Games Workshop's not a cheap game, we all know that, and with the price increase coming next month, yay! But, 40K has advantages. It's not as hard on your pocketbook as Fantasy. A typical 40K army, if you're a Space Marine or Chaos player, what, 30, 40, 50 models maybe at 1,500, 1,700 points. Where in Fantasy, when you play a 2,000 point game, it's not uncommon to have 80 to 100 models. If you play a Horde army, it can have even more. I've had a Skaven army that had 200. So, of course, with that cost, as we all know, there's more cost with more models. So I think that's one thing that helps attract people to 40K initially, is it's not as costly to have a 40K army as it is a Fantasy army. Alright guys, I don't know if you guys got anything out of it. I just wanted to give a quick overview. I watched Mr. Biotrek's 310's video and made me realize, like I said earlier, that I wanted to give an overview, and my How to Play Warhammer Fantasy series evolved into something different. If you guys have any questions or whatever, just post them down below, in the comment section. You guys know how to do that. And hope you guys have a good one. and you'll see some battle reports hopefully soon. Signing out. Later.